Hello, everybody. Today we're getting a presentation by Nancy Natel. Her presentation is on software documentation requirements for a 510K submission. This specific presentation is about devices with a software moderate level of concern, but there are also ones with a low level of concern and high level of concern. Her expertise is software validation, and I'll hand the presentation over to Nancy.
Great, Rob. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this, because I think this is very confusing for people who are working with software and wondering how they can actually submit to the FDA. And it's actually quite straightforward, although the work that you need to do to get to this level can be quite daunting. So we're going to talk a little bit about moderate level of concern. Partially because generally there is rarely a use for low level of concern for software. And if anybody's interested in more about high level of concern, they certainly can come back to us and ask us questions. And we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to move to the next slide. And okay, so we're going to start right in and talk about what the software documentation is required for the 510K. And so, again, we talked about level of concern. We do need to have a specific document. Now, everywhere that it says a document, you need to have a specific document that states this. And for moderate level of concern, you need a statement indicating the level of concern and a description of the rationale for that level. You're going to need a software description, and this is a summary overview of the features and software operating system environment. Device hazard analysis. This is a tabular description of identified hardware and software hazards, including severity assessments and mitigations. This is something that you will define and identify as you go through the process. A software requirements spec. Again, this is a software design specification document. An architectural design chart, and this is a detailed depiction of functional units and software modules. It may include state diagrams as well as flow charts. Again, we're going to talk about specifically about each one of these documents as we go further. I'm just going to go quickly through the documentation. Okay. As you can see, there's also another page full of these documents: software design specification, traceability analysis, software development environment description, verification and validation document. This is where you're going to find a lot of the work is going to be involved in, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. Your revision level history. This is a revision history log including release version, number, and date. So you need to be able to provide that to the FDA. And finally, an unresolved anomalies report. So this is a list of the remaining software anomalies annotated with an explanation of the impact on safety or effectiveness, including operator usage and human factors that may be involved in these particular anomalies. Okay, so we're going to go back to talk about each one of these documents. So we're talking about the level of concern document. Now, this is not the class of the software that you're developing or the device that you're developing. This has to do with the specific level of concern for your software. And again, you will find this information from the FDA guidances. And you need to clearly document which one of the 3 levels of concern is appropriate for the device and include that documentation of the rationale for your decision. So you can't just submit a document that says, we say this is a level of concern for your our software is level of concern moderate. You have to actually ensure that the documentation makes it clear to the FDA how you came about that definition. So this is where you start getting into a little bit more of the engineering of the software. You start talking about the software description document, and this is a comprehensive overview of the device features that are controlled by software. And you need to describe the intended operational environment as you do. So some of the things that you'll find in a software description that should be there are the programming language, the hardware platform, the operating system, if applicable, and any use of off-the-shelf or soup software that you will be using. So you are responsible for the quality and the safety of soup software that you do use, and there is a whole process involved in actually validating soup software, but that information needs to be provided. And again, if this information is in another document, such as a software requirement specification, you can point to that, but you should still contain, it should still contain an annotated document that gives a reference to the specific location of the document in the submission. So you need to actually put in a software description document that says, look at the software requirement specification. The next part of this is the device hazard analysis document. And this is a fairly important aspect of software 510K submittal. This is where you provide a device hazard analysis for all software devices. So again, this could be software on your hardware, or this could be standalone software. It should take into account all device hazards associated with devices' intended use, including both hardware and software hazards. And it's important to present it in a tabular form with a line item for each identified hazard. And here's what should be in the documentation: identification of the hazard event, severity of the hazard, causes of the hazard, methods of control, either is it an alarm or a hardware design, corrective measures taken, including an explanation of the aspects of the device, design requirements that eliminate, reduce, or warn of hazardous events, and verification that the method of control was implemented correctly. So it means that you don't just say that there's a risk here, you show that you have tested and verified that the risk mitigation that you have put in place actually has been completed, and you'll be submitting that later in the verification documents we'll talk about later. And so when you do perform this hazard analysis, you have to make sure that you address all foreseen hazards, include those resulting from intentional or inadvertent misuse of the device. So you are responsible for hazard analysis on your device and defining it, documenting it, and mitigating it. And I think Rob did a great presentation a little while ago that talks about FMEA, and probably that's something you should discuss with Rob about that to get that presentation to help you further. Now, the software requirements spec is basically your recipe. This typically includes functional performance, interface design development, but it specifies the requirements for the software. What is this software going to do? How does it do it? When you press this button, what happens when you press this button? Or what happens when you issue this command? This is what the software requirement specification is all about. And it's important within the software requirement specification that you're defining it clearly. You're telling you're telling your engineers what you want clearly to be developed, but you're also telling the FDA specifically what you have designed so that they know how your product works. And so for software that are identified for a moderate level of concern, you need to provide the complete SRS document, and it should include the following information if applicable: hardware requirement, programming language requirements, what programming language are you using. You need to have an interface document that defines your interface requirements and the software performance and functional requirements of that particular software. Okay, so then we can talk about the architectural design chart document. This document is typically a flow chart or similar depiction of the relationships among the major functional units in the software device, including relationships to hardware and to data flow, such as networking. It's not necessary to include every function call. You just really make sure that you have sufficient information to be able to understand how the software is organized relative to the device or your operating system and the functionality intended use of the software device. Now, some of the confusion comes in when I use the word software device. The FDA considers standalone software as a device, and so they use the term software device. And it can also be software on a specific device as well, but they do consider software as a device. So for moderate level of concern devices, detailed information such as state diagrams may be useful to clearly depict the relationships amongst the software functional units. If the architectural design chart is included in another document, such as the SRS, you need to again include a submission in the submission, a statement to that effect, referencing the location of the architectural design chart in further other areas of your submission. So again, you need to actually put in a physical document that states where it's located. Software design specification. And in terms of, there's really a lot of confusion between the concept of software requirements and software design. In many areas, the software design specification and the SRS can be the same document, especially if it's standalone software and there are not a lot of different units. So if you have a wireless controller controlling your unit, you would have a software design that would talk to communications, you would have it talk to the design of the front end of the wireless controller, and you would have a software design speaking to the receptive device. But if your software is specifically just a single piece of software running on a computer, you may have these being both the same thing. Again, its information presented in the SDS should be sufficient to ensure that the work performed by the software engineers who create the software device are clear about what they need to design. The information is unambiguous, and there needs to be no ad hoc design decisions. I know there's a concept of minimal ad hoc design decisions, but really the FDA frowns on a whole bunch of engineers all of a sudden filling up your repository with a bunch of code and not knowing how it's really supposed to work. And we'll get to that more as we talk about validation verification. And again, the SDS may contain references to other documents, such as detailed software specifications. However, the document submitted, again, should in it of itself provide adequate information to allow for review of the implementation plan for software requirements in terms of intended use, functionality, safety, and effectiveness. So that's where you would define this. So you still do need an SDS document. Okay, so now we come to something called traceability analysis. This is where the FDA determines, by looking at traceability, that you have in fact developed and verified exactly what you say that you have intended to do. So a traceability analysis links together product design requirements, design specification, and testing requirements, and provides a means of tying those all together to identified hazards with the implementation and testing of the mitigations. So this traceability will show to the FDA that not only have you said you're going to develop this particular type of communication between a wireless controller and your piece of hardware, but you've actually implemented it in this fashion using these types of designs, and you've tested it in this way using this test. It is recommended that you submit for review explicit traceability amongst these activities, not just kind of an idea that we use the software requirements to develop this, some statement. That really doesn't work. And so traceability analysis commonly consists of a matrix with line items for requirements, specifications, and tests, and pointers to hazard mitigations. And that's the way that you show to the FDA that you have, in fact, tested what you have proposed and designed and ensured that the safety of the hazard mitigations have been tested. This can be quite cumbersome. This can take quite some time. There are some softwares out there that help you with that. I think DOORS is a common application that helps people with traceability analysis. It is quite pricey. There's some other applications out there that can be used that are a little less expensive, but to ensure that you do have the traceability analysis is key. I've done it on spreadsheets and it has functioned well. You know, it's kind of possible to document traceability through a shared organizational structure with common numbering scheme. However, it really is recommended that you do some kind of traceability matrix so that the reviewer can go through the information that you submit. You can say, well, it's probably, you can just submit something that's kind of casual, but ultimately you want the reviewer to be very comfortable that you have actually designed what you said you designed. And part of that is because the FDA is somewhat, well, they're skeptical about software, and you want to give the FDA the opportunity to say, wow, you've done a really good job, you've done it fine, we're not going to even worry about it anymore. So anything you can do to give the FDA a good feeling that you are concerned about the risk possibilities in software really is a good way to ensure your 510K gets a faster track. Okay, so we come here to verification and validation documentation. There's a little bit of a challenge in people understanding the difference between verification and validation. Verification and validation don't actually mean the same thing. When you're talking about verification, you're verifying that your software actually works the way you say it's going to work, and that means that you have thoroughly tested it. Validation means that you have created the software that you intend to create. So if you say that your software is supposed to be controlled by a wireless controller and you click, you're going to prove that it actually can be controlled by a wireless controller, you're validating that you are creating a wireless controller application. But not only that, that the wireless controller is easy to use because part of validation is usability, and your customer is able to use it, and all errors and possibilities that your customer may face have been tested for. So going through this, it's important to understand that for moderate level of concern of your devices, you need to submit a final summary list of validation and verification activities and the results of those activities. You need to submit your pass-fail criteria, and you need to ensure that the traceability analysis effectively links these activities and results to the design requirements and specifications. And I think it's important to understand what we're talking about here as far as verifying your software's functionality. We're not just talking about algorithm testing. This means algorithm testing is certainly a part of verification and validation, and certainly a part of clinical analysis. You want to make sure your algorithms are performing correctly. Say that you're delivering a particular amount of fluid. You want to make sure your algorithms are definitely delivering that amount of fluid. But the verification and validation means you have thoroughly tested the entire application for all of its functionality, its reporting functionality, its logging functionality, its error control functionality, its hazard control functionality, its user interface, functionality or device interface functionality if you're working in an environment where your software is providing data to another device. So it is not just testing the algorithm. The FDA wants to see that every one of the requirements that you have defined clearly has been tested. So this starts talking about the link between your definitions in your SRS and your testing. It is important that when you're defining your requirements in your SRS that they are distinct and they are testable. And what I mean by that is that when you define your requirements, you can verify what your requirements say they're going to do. Some of the bad words you see in requirements are the words and or. If you see and or in your requirements, it means that you have defined two requirements. If you see something vague like the software shall stop in some casually or something like that, you can't say that. You have to say the software will stop in 5 milliseconds. So if it does not receive a signal. So part of this is defining clearly what's in your software. Verification and validation is the opposite part of that. It will ensure that what you've defined in your software actually is taking place. So this is another important aspect that the FDA wants to see all your verification and validation documents, all the pass-fail criteria that has been established. Your documents should pass everything, unless there are bugs out in extent, and we'll talk about those later in the next couple, and when we talk about residual bugs. So. Okay, oops, sorry, this is a little control. Revision level history document. So this is very important because they want to see that you've actually done iterations of your software and that you just haven't shown up with a whole bunch of software, released it, and then sort of ad hoc tested it. They want to see what the revisions are that you've generated during the course of the product development, and you can put this in the form of a table that talks about major changes to the software during the development cycle, including date, version number, and a brief description of the changes in the version. So you're going to have version 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and here's where you document what changes that you're making in this documentation. So that the FDA knows how you've moved forward in developing your software. And the last entry in the list should be the final version to be incorporated in the release device. And this entry should also include any references between tested version of the software and the release version, along with an assessment of the potential effect of the differences on the safety and effectiveness of the device. And I think that it talks to residual risk elements, residual bugs, and generally you try to use the final version as your testing version. So there's a little bit of confusion around this, I think, for people. So we come to unresolved anomalies, bugs, or defects. Most companies have the concept that if it is a high-level bug, like we call it a P1 bug, or companies sometimes have different levels, but a crash bug or a bug that causes a serious amount of harm, the software review board that you set up, which should include your development organization and your quality organization as well as clinical, will decide that we can't send this product out with this particular bug. It's too much. We're going to respin it, retest it. Okay. But let's just say that there's an anomaly that comes out of it, and you say that the residual risk is minor. You document it. Say it's a pixel color that doesn't really affect usability, or it's a small problem in text somewhere that really is maybe in a log file or something like that, where a customer won't be affected by that, you need to document that. You need to document the device impact. You also need to document the plan or time frame for correcting the problem where appropriate. So again, this is another document. You need to identify each item with an explanation of the impact of the anomaly on the device. Typically, this list can be generated as an output of a change control board, as I said, or similar mechanisms for evaluation and disposition of unresolved software anomalies. You need to communicate this list to the end user as appropriate, so they can help in understanding the proper operation of the device. And in all instances where it's practical to do so, include any mitigations or possible workarounds for unresolved anomalies. It is important to understand that every single one of these documents, including the Unresolved Anomalies document, is signed by responsible people in the organization. So it's not just a document stating that there are issues here. It is also a document that says that we are taking responsibility for the fact that these unresolved anomalies are there, or we have designed the software to be safe and effective. So understanding that is key to understanding this whole process, that it's not just the software engineer who signs these documents, it's everybody who has the responsibility of ensuring the safety of the device will be signing these documents and taking responsibility for the safety and risk of them. So that's my presentation. If you have any more questions about what is required for software for an FDA submittal, please feel free to contact either one of us. Certainly you can contact me at Signet Medical Systems, or our Rob Packard at his 13485 certification company. And I hope that if you have enjoyed this and this was helpful for you.
Nancy, this will be posted on the website shortly.